My mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon in October and said she had something wonderful to share. Her voice had the specific warmth she reserved for occasions when she wanted something, fuller than her usual register, rounded at the edges, the voice of a woman who had decided to be generous before she had decided what the generosity would cost. She said, "Sweetheart, we've been thinking about you so much lately." I said, "Have you?" She said, "Your father and I were talking last night and we both agreed that it's been too long, that we miss you. That family is family and some things are bigger than old disagreements." I said, "Old disagreements." She said, "You know what I mean, Miriam. The past is the past. What matters now is that we're reaching out." What she called an old disagreement had a specific date, February 14th, 16 years ago. When I was 15 years old, and in the 10th grade, and my parents had set 3 garbage bags of my belongings on the front step of the house on Millbrook Road, and told me I was no longer welcome in their home. Valentine's Day. I had always found the date somewhat on the nose. She said, "We heard you got married." I said, 3 years ago, yes." She said, "We heard there might be some news. A family growing." I said, "Where did you hear that?" She said, "Your cousin Bet mentioned something." "Just that you'd been trying," I said. "Bet talks too much." My mother laughed. The warm, rounded laugh. She said, "We just wanted you to know that we're here. That if there's a grandchild coming, we want to be part of that. We want to be a family again." I said, "I'll think about it." She said, "That's all we ask, sweetheart." I held the phone after the call ended, and I looked out the window of the home I had built in Denver, Colorado in the 12 years since I had last spoken to either of my parents. And I thought about the 3 garbage bags on a February front step, and I thought about everything that had happened between that February and this October, and I thought about the thing my mother did not know. The news she had heard was not the news she thought it was, and what I was about to do with the call she had just made was not what she thought I was going to do either. Let me take you back to where this started. Because garbage bags on a Valentine's Day front step do not exist without a context, and the context is the whole story. My name is Miriam Osei Callahan. I am 31 years old. I am a licensed architect and the co-founder of a design firm in Denver, Colorado called Osei Callahan Architecture that my husband and I established 4 years ago, and that has in those 4 years produced work that I am genuinely proud of in the specific way that pride works when it is attached to things you built from nothing. I also have parents who put me out of their house on Valentine's Day when I was 15 years old. I am going to tell you the full story of both of those things, because the distance between them is the story, and the story requires both ends of it to make sense. I grew up in a suburb of Cincinnati called Madeira, in a house that looked from the outside like the house of a family that had things well organized. 4 bedrooms, a yard, a car in the driveway that was replaced every 4 years with the specific regularity of people who managed the appearance of comfort carefully. My father, Douglas Osei, had immigrated from Kumasi in his 20s and had built a career as an accountant that was solid and mid-level, and that he managed with the same precision he applied to everything in his life, including his children. My mother, Patricia, had grown up in Cincinnati and had married my father at 24, and had spent the intervening years constructing the specific version of the Osei family that she wanted the world to see. The version of the Osei family that the world saw was organized around my brother, Jerome. Jerome was 4 years older than me, which meant he was graduating high school the year I started it, and which meant that most of his reign as the family's primary subject had occurred in years I was too young to fully track. What I tracked was the residue of it, the specific way my parents' attention operated in rooms, always angled toward Jerome, always calibrated against his achievements and his needs and his social life and his college ambitions. Jerome was genuinely talented. I want to say this because he was, and because accuracy matters. He was a gifted athlete and a reasonable student, and had the social ease of someone whose parents had spent 17 years constructing the conditions for social ease to flourish. He was charming and self-assured, and had, By the time he left for Ohio State on a partial baseball scholarship, the August I started ninth grade, established in my parents' minds the specific template against which all family achievement would be measured. I did not match the template. Not because I was not capable, I was capable in specific ways that the template did not account for. I was good at drawing. I was good at spatial reasoning. I was good at the specific kind of thinking that looks at a structure and understands both what it is and what it could be, which is a way of thinking that produces architects and engineers, and people who are described in childhood as having their head in the clouds by people who have not yet understood what the clouds contain. I was also, at 15, in a romantic relationship that my parents had not authorized and would not have authorized if I had asked. I did not ask. His name was Daniel Callahan, which is a name that should tell you something about the specific nature of the authorization problem. Daniel was 16 in 11th grade Irish Catholic, the son of a family from the working-class neighborhood adjacent to Madeira, and the combination of his age, his background, and his existence in my life was something my parents had identified and addressed twice with conversations that I had received and not heeded, because I was 15 and in love in the way that 15-year-olds are in love, which is completely and without adequate strategic planning. My parents discovered, on a February Thursday that happened to be Valentine's Day, through a phone call from someone at my school whose motivations I have spent 16 years trying to understand and have mostly stopped caring about, that Daniel and I had been dating for 6 months. Not that I was pregnant, not that anything had occurred that warranted the response that followed. Simply that I had been dating a boy they had told me not to date. My father was home when I arrived from school that afternoon. This was unusual. He was typically at the office until 6. The 3 garbage bags were on the front step. He was standing in the doorway. He said, "Your things are packed." I said, "Dad." He said, "You have disrespected this family and you have disobeyed every boundary we established for you. You are not welcome in this house." I said, "Where am I supposed to go?" He said, "That is not a question I'm able to answer for you." My mother appeared behind him. She did not say anything. I stood on the front step of the house I had grown up in, with 3 garbage bags at my feet, on Valentine's Day at 15 years old, and I understood several things simultaneously. I understood that my father meant it. I understood that my mother was not going to intervene. I understood that whatever I did in the next hour would determine whether the following days were manageable or catastrophic. I picked up 2 of the bags. I left the 3rd. I walked 4 blocks to the house of my English teacher, Ms. Priya Venkatson, who I had told in October that things at home were difficult, and who had said then, "If you ever need somewhere safe to go, my door is open." She opened the door. I said, "They put me out." She said, "Come inside." She called her sister, who was a social worker. The sister came within an hour. There were phone calls and processes and the specific administrative machinery that activates when a 15-year-old appears on a teacher's doorstep with 2 garbage bags. My parents, when contacted, confirmed that they had made the decision and declined to reverse it. I was placed with a foster family. The Hendersons, a couple in their 50s in Anderson Township, who had been fostering for 12 years and who had in those 12 years developed the specific gift of providing stability without requiring it to look like anything other than what it was. I finished the 10th grade from the Henderson house. I finished 11th and 12th grade from the Henderson house. I got a full scholarship to the University of Cincinnati's architecture program, which I had been working toward since I was 12 years old and drawing floor plans of the houses on my street. Daniel Callahan and I broke up 6 months after I left my parents' house. Not from any dramatic incident, but from the specific weight of what had happened, and the different directions we were heading, and the honest assessment of 2 teenagers who had cared for each other genuinely, and understood that the caring was not sufficient for what they both needed. We stayed in contact, not closely, not romantically, but with the specific warmth of people who had been present for something significant together and carried that presence forward. He became a contractor. I became an architect. We ended up in Denver. We found each other at 35 and 26, respectively. I was 25, and he was 29, through the mutual friend of a mutual friend at a professional networking event for construction and design professionals. And the reconnection was the specific experience of meeting someone you have history with and discovering that the people you have both become are better suited to each other than the people you were. He said, at the networking event, Miriam Osai. I said, Daniel Callahan. He said, you're an architect. I said, you're a contractor. He said, we should probably talk. We talked for 3 hours. We were engaged 11 months later. I took his name because I wanted to, not because it was expected, and because Osai Callahan was the name of the firm we were going to build together, and I wanted my name on it in the order that reflected both of us. My parents were not at the wedding. Not because I had not considered inviting them. I had considered it. I had conducted the consideration with the same careful attention I applied to every significant decision, examining it from multiple angles, consulting the people I trusted, sitting with the question long enough to be certain the answer was mine and not reactive. The answer was, not yet, not never. Not an act of permanent severance. A boundary that reflected where I was with the relationship at that point in time, which was, not ready. Not prepared to introduce Daniel to the people who had put me on a front step at 15 for the crime of loving him. Not able to give that specific symbolic weight to a day that was supposed to be about joy. The answer was not yet, and the not yet had been holding for 3 years when my mother called in October. My cousin Bet had told her the news. The news was real, and it was mine, and it was not what my mother thought it was, and what I am about to tell you about it is the part of this story that determines everything else. I want to tell you about the news carefully, because the news is complicated, and the complication is not drama for its own sake, but the specific complexity of real life, which does not organize itself around narrative convenience. Daniel and I had been trying to start a family for approximately 2 years. The trying had produced over those 2 years 2 miscarriages and 1 failed round of IVF, and the specific grief of that specific process. Which is a grief that is real, and that is also shared by more people than talk about it, and that I had been navigating with Daniel, and with my therapist, and with Josephine, who was my closest friend in Denver, and with the Hendersons, who had remained my family of the heart since I was 15, and who I called every Sunday the way some people call their parents. What Bet had heard, from another cousin who had heard from someone who knew someone, was that I was pregnant. What was actually true was that I was in the process of a 2nd round of IVF that had, in the 2 weeks before my mother's October call, produced a positive test. A fragile, early, not yet ready to be announced positive test. A test I had told no one except Daniel and Josephine and Mrs. Henderson. A test that could still go the way the previous 2 had gone. Bet had heard a rumor. The rumor was adjacent to reality, but not the same as reality. And my mother had heard the rumor and had called, and I had said I'll think about it, and I had been thinking about it ever since. Here is what I want you to understand about what I was thinking. I was not thinking about revenge. I was not thinking about constructing a situation in which my parents would be hurt the way they had hurt me. Not because that impulse was entirely absent. I am a human being, and I had been put on a front step at 15. But because I had spent 16 years processing that impulse in the specific contained way that you process things when you have good therapy and good people around you, and have decided that the energy required for sustained resentment is energy that could build something instead. What I was thinking about was truth. The truth of who my parents were and what they had done and what they were now seeking. The truth of who I was and what I had built and what I was navigating. The truth of what a relationship with my parents could and could not be, given all of that truth on both sides. And the specific question of whether the relationship they were now seeking, the grandparent relationship, the we want to be a family again relationship, was one that they had earned or were seeking to acquire on the basis of a rumor about my reproductive life. I called Josephine. She said, tell me. I told her. The call, the warmth in my mother's voice, the old disagreement. The grandchild. Josephine said, "She called because she heard there was a baby coming." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not because she spent 16 years working through what she did to you." I said, "Correct." She said, "And you're thinking about what to do with the call." I said, "I'm thinking about what's true." She said, "What's true is that you're pregnant and it's fragile and you don't need this right now." I said, "I know." She said, "What's also true is that you have a right to decide when and how your parents re-enter your life, and the terms of that re-entry are entirely yours to set." I said, "Yes." She said, "So what do you want?" I thought about it. I said, "I want them to understand what they did, not as a performance, as a genuine reckoning. I want a conversation where the truth of what happened is named directly, not called an old disagreement." She said, "And if they can't have that conversation?" I said, "Then the relationship they're trying to access isn't available to them." She said, "And the baby?" I said, "The baby is mine and Daniel's. The baby is not a resource I am making available to people who have not done the work of being trustworthy." Josephine said, "Okay." "So what are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to call my mother back, and I'm going to be honest." She said, "What kind of honest?" I said, "The kind where I name the thing that happened, not to punish them. To find out if they're capable of hearing it." She said, "And if they're not," I said, "then the conversation ends and I have my answer." She said, "And if they are," I said, "then we have a different conversation, a longer one that takes time." She said, "Miriam." I said, "Yes." She said, "Whatever happens, the baby is fine. You're doing everything right. The IVF result was good." I said, "I know." She said, "Focus on that first." I said, "I am. That's why I'm having this conversation now instead of letting it fester." She said, "That's the most therapist-adjacent thing you've ever said." I said, 12 years of therapy will do that." She said, "Call me after you talk to them." I said, "I will." "Are you the person in your family that got left behind while everyone else moved forward?" Drop a comment below and tell me your story. And subscribe right now, because what happens when Miriam calls her mother back is the part that nobody saw coming, including her parents. I called my mother back on a Thursday evening, 4 days after the initial call. I had discussed it with Daniel first. Daniel's relationship with the concept of my parents was complicated in the specific way it would be for any person who understood that his existence in my life had been the stated cause of the worst thing that had happened to that life. He was not angry in an active way. He had processed his version of it in his own time and through his own resources. But he held a specific clarity about what was owed and what was not owed that was useful to me as a reality check when my own clarity got foggy. He said, "What do you want from the call?" I said, "I want to find out if they're capable of being honest about what they did." He said, "And if they are," I said, "then I want to think about what a limited and carefully boundaried relationship with them looks like." He said, "And if they're not?" I said, "Then I want to know that too, definitively, instead of with the ambiguity that's existed for 16 years. He said, "I support either outcome." I said, "I know you do." He said, "One more thing." I said, "Yes." He said, "Don't tell them about the pregnancy. Not tonight. Not until we know more." I said, "I wasn't planning to." He said, "I know. I'm saying it out loud so it's said." I said, "It's said." He kissed me on the forehead and went to his office to finish a project drawing, and I sat in our living room with my phone and I called my mother. She answered in one ring. She said, "Miriam, I'm so glad you called back." I said I'd think about it. She said, "Yes. How are you feeling?" I said, "Mom, I need to tell you something before we go any further with this conversation." She said, "Of course. What is it?" I said, "What you called an old disagreement when you called me last Tuesday has a specific name, and I need you to use the specific name before we can have any other conversation." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Miriam." I said, "You put me out of the house on Valentine's Day when I was 15 years old. You and Dad. You packed 3 garbage bags with my things, and you put them on the front step, and Dad told me I was not welcome in the house, and you did not intervene. I walked 4 blocks to my teacher's house, and I was placed in foster care. I did not come home. You did not attempt to bring me home. I finished high school from a foster placement. The line was completely quiet. I said, that is what happened. I need you to say it the way it happened, without calling it an old disagreement, before we can have any other conversation. My mother said, Miriam. I said, I'm waiting. She said, it's your father and I said, Mom, I'm not asking for an explanation right now. I'm asking for an acknowledgement, the specific factual acknowledgement of what you did. Can you do that? Another silence. She said, we put you out of the house. At 15. I said, on Valentine's Day. She said, on Valentine's Day. I said, with 3 garbage bags. She said, yes. I said, and I was placed in foster care. She said, yes. I said, because I was dating a boy you didn't approve of. Her voice, when it came back, was different from the warm, rounded voice of the first call. It was smaller, more careful. She said, because we handled it wrong. I said, yes. She said, we handled it so wrong. I said, yes. She said, Miriam, I have your father and I have. She stopped. I have thought about that day every day for 16 years. I said, have you? She said, not in a way that let me call you. I didn't know how to call you after that long. I didn't know what I would say. I said, you could have started with what you just said to me. She said, I know. I said, you called me because you heard there was a grandchild coming. She was quiet. I said, I need you to be honest with me. Would you have called me without that? The silence was long enough that it was its own answer. She said, I don't know. I said, that's honest. She said, I'd like to think I would have. Eventually. I said, I believe you'd like to think that. She said, Miriam, we made a terrible mistake. I said, yes. She said, we made a terrible mistake and it has cost us everything. Every year since then, every birthday of yours I've watched come and go. Every milestone I heard about from people who weren't us. We lost 16 years. I said, you lost 16 years. I built 16 years. She said, I know. I said, those two things are not the same. She said, I know they're not. I said, I'm not going to invite you back into my life on the basis of a rumor about a grandchild. I want to be very clear about that. She said, I understand. I said, a relationship with me, if we build one, will be built on honesty, on the acknowledgement of what happened, on your being present in my life because you want to be in relationship with me, not because you want access to something you believe I have. She said, of course that's what we want. I said, I don't know that yet. Neither do you. We haven't been in relationship for 16 years. We have no basis to know what we want from each other yet. She said, what can we do? I said, you can start by having this same conversation with my father. She said, he's here. He's been listening. I said, good, Dad. My father's voice, when it came, was rough in a way I had not heard in the one-dimensional memory I had of it. He said, Miriam. I said, Dad. He said, I put you on that step. I said, yes. He said, I handed you those bags. I said those words. I said, yes. He said, there is nothing I can say that is adequate to that. I said, I'm not asking for adequate. I'm asking for honest. He said, I was wrong. In every possible way a person can be wrong, I was wrong. I said, yes. He said, if I could take it back. I said, you can't. He said, I know. I said, what you can do is be honest from this point forward. About what happened, about what you're asking for. He said, we're asking for the chance to know you, not a grandchild. You, I said, that's the right answer. He said, it's the true answer. I said, I'll need time to know that. He said, we have time. We'll wait. I said, I'm going to speak with my therapist about this conversation. I'm going to talk with my husband. And at some point, not soon in the future, I want to have a longer conversation. In person. My mother said, we'll come to Denver. I said, I know. That's why I said in person. She said, we'll come whenever you're ready. I said, I'll be in touch. I said, one more thing. They both waited. I said, the news you heard from Bet. The news you called about. My mother said, yes. I said, it's more complicated than what you heard. I'm not going to tell you more than that right now. What I want you to understand is that you called me based on a rumor about my reproductive life. I need you to understand that whatever is or is not happening in that part of my life is mine. It is not an invitation. It is not a resource. It is mine and my husband's. My mother said, I understand. I said, do you? She said, yes. Miriam, I understand. We called you for the wrong reason and we know it. We called you because we were afraid if we didn't call now, we would never call. I said, I believe that. I said, it was still the wrong reason. She said, yes. I said, I'll be in touch. I hung up. I sat in the living room for a long time. Daniel appeared in the doorway of his office. He said, how was it? I said, they said the right things. He said, do you believe them? I said, I believe they meant what they said in the moment. Whether they're capable of sustaining it is a longer question. He said, how do you feel? I said, like I've been carrying something heavy for a very long time and I've just set it down to look at it. I haven't put it down yet. I'm just looking at it. He said, that's significant. I said, yes. He came and sat beside me. He said, the baby is okay. I said, I know. He said, whatever happens with them doesn't change the baby. I said, I know that. That's why I could have the conversation tonight instead of waiting until I was more certain. He said, certain of what? I said, certain that I could hold both things at the same time, the conversation with them and the fragile good thing that is ours. He said, can you? I said, yes, as long as I'm careful about what I let them mean. They are one part of the picture. The baby is the center. He said, yes. He said, I love you. I said, I know. The pregnancy continued. I want to tell you about the pregnancy, not in the clinical terms of a medical report, but in the terms of what it actually was, which was the most significant daily experience of my professional and personal life, running simultaneously with everything else. I was working. I was designing a mixed-use residential and commercial building in Denver's Rhino neighborhood that was the most ambitious project O.C. Callahan Architecture had undertaken, and that required, in those months, approximately 50 hours a week of the specific focused attention that design at that scale requires. Daniel was the contractor on 2 parallel projects. We were both working at full capacity, and I was pregnant. The fragile early positive test held through the 8-week scan. It held through the 12-week scan. It held through the 16-week scan, at which point my OB said, this looks stable. This looks like a pregnancy that is continuing. I cried in the car afterward, not from the news, from the specific weight of relief, which is heavier than you expect when you have been carrying the absence of it for 2 years. Daniel was with me. He did not cry, but his jaw was set in the specific way that it set when he was holding something significant. He said, it's going well. I said, it is. He said, you're going to be someone's mother. I said, we're going to be someone's parents. He said, yes. I said, I want to call the Hendersons. He said, call them. I called the Hendersons from the hospital parking lot. Mrs. Henderson answered, and I told her, and she made the specific sound that she made when something was genuinely right, a long exhale, and then a quiet yes, a sound I had been hearing from her for 16 years at moments that mattered. She said, how are you feeling? I said, like something is going right. She said, something is going right. A lot of things are going right. I said, I know. She said, when are you going to tell people? I said, we're telling family this week. Close people, she said, and your parents. I had told her about the October call. I said, after I tell you, you're before them. She said, Miriam, I said, it's true. You're before them in every relevant way. You're before them in order of importance and in order of earning the information. She was quiet for a moment. She said, are you going to tell them? I said, yes, but on my terms, in person. She said, when? I said, I've asked them to come to Denver next month. I have things to say that require a room and faces and the inability to hang up. She said, do you want me there? I said, no, this is something I need to do with Daniel and without a support structure in the room. The support structure is for after. She said, I'll be right here after. I said, I know, that's why I can do the before. The conversation with my parents was happening at a level that required me to also be having conversations with Dr. Soa, my therapist, who had been with me through the fertility process and who was now with me through the parent process with the same specific quality of attention that had characterized 12 years of our work together. Dr. Soa said, tell me what you want from the in-person meeting. I said, I want them to understand the full picture. Not just what they did, the full picture, what happened after, what the Hendersons gave me, what I built, who I am. I want them to understand what they missed and what I made in the space of what they missed. She said, "Why is that important?" I said, "Because if they're going to be in my life going forward, they need to be in it accurately. Not in the version where they are the parents who made a mistake and are now being forgiven and everyone moves forward. In the version where they made a mistake and I built something extraordinary in the space of it, and the relationship has to account for both." She said, "What does accounting for both look like?" I said, "It looks like honesty about who the family is and who it isn't. The Hendersons are my family. Josephine is my family. Daniel is my family. My parents are people I am in the process of deciding whether I can be in relationship with. Those are different categories." She said, "What would make the relationship possible?" I said, "Demonstrated change over time, not a single good conversation." "Time," she said, "and if they can demonstrate it." I said, "Then the relationship is real and not just performed." She said, "And the baby?" I said, "The baby will know its grandparents when and if the grandparents have earned that. Not before." She said, "That's a clear position." I said, "I've had 16 years to develop it." My parents flew to Denver on a Saturday in January. I was 20 weeks pregnant. I was not showing in a way that announced itself under the clothes I was wearing, which was deliberate. I had chosen what I wore that day with the specific consideration that I did not want the pregnancy to be the visual center of the meeting. They arrived at our home at 10 in the morning. The drive from the airport had given them whatever conversation they needed to have before arriving, and they came to the door with the specific quality of two people who had organized themselves for something significant and were holding the organization carefully. My mother looked older than the last time I had seen her, which was 16 years ago, and which meant I was comparing a 31-year-old to a 47-year-old to a woman I was reconstructing from memory. She was smaller than I remembered, or I was larger than I had been. Probably both. My father looked tired in a way that was structural rather than situational, the tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. I opened the door. My mother said, "Miriam." I said, "Mom, Dad, come in." Daniel was in the kitchen. He came out and shook my father's hand and accepted my mother's embrace with the specific controlled warmth of a man who was doing something difficult and was doing it correctly. We sat in the living room. I said, "I want to tell you some things before we have any other conversation." They sat. I said, "After you put me on the step, I walked to Ms. Priya Venkateson's house. She called her sister, who was a social worker. I was placed with the Henderson family in Anderson Township, where I lived for 3 years until I graduated. Carol and Robert Henderson are the people I call my parents in every practical and emotional sense. They came to my college graduation. They came to my wedding. They are who I call when something significant happens. My father closed his eyes briefly. I said, "I finished at the top of my class at Cincinnati. I received a full scholarship. I completed my architecture degree in 5 years and moved to Denver. I built a firm with my husband. We have done work that I am proud of." I said, "I also spent 2 years trying to start a family, which included 2 miscarriages and 1 failed round of IVF. My mother made a sound that was not a word. I said, "I'm telling you this because if you are going to be in my life, you need to be in it accurately. Not in the version where the difficult parts are smoothed over. In the version where the full picture is visible." I said, "What you called an old disagreement when you first called me was the worst thing that happened to me in my childhood. It was also the thing that produced, in the space it created, the people and the experiences that made me who I am. I am not grateful for what you did. I am not going to perform gratitude for it. What I can tell you is that I survived it and built something real from it, and that the building is the evidence that I am not someone who was destroyed by you." My father said, "We know." I said, "I'm not sure you do. I'm not sure you have a complete picture of what happened between 15 and 31. He said, "Tell us." I told them. I told them about the Hendersons and the specific texture of what it meant to be fostered by people who understood that stability was the most important thing, and provided it without requiring you to perform gratitude for it. I told them about the architecture scholarship and what it meant to find the thing I had always been moving toward and to find it on my own terms. I told them about Daniel and how we had found each other again and what the reconnection had meant and what the firm had produced. I told them about the fertility process and the 2 miscarriages and what that grief was like and how Daniel and I had navigated it. I told them about the Hendersons again because the Hendersons deserved to be mentioned twice. My mother cried through significant portions of this, not the managed tears of the phone call, actual crying, the kind that comes when something lands in a place you have been protecting. My father did not cry, but his hands were clasped on his knees in the specific posture of a man who is holding himself together with precision, because the alternative is not available to him in this moment. When I finished, the room was quiet. My father said, "I have one question." I said, "Ask it." He said, "The Hendersons. Are they what a parent should be?" I said, "They are what they are," which is people who showed up every day for 16 years regardless of what it cost them. "That's what a parent should be," he said, "and we weren't." I said, "Not to me, not for those 16 years. He said, "I don't know how to repair 16 years. I said, "You can't. You can only be present from today forward." He said, "Is today forward available to us?" I said, "I don't know yet. I'm in the process of finding out." My mother said, "The pregnancy." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you?" I said, "I'm 20 weeks. It's going well." She said, "I'm so." She stopped. She started again. She said, "I'm so glad for you." I said, "I know." She said, "Can I ask?" I said, "Ask it." She said, "Is there any possibility of us being?" She couldn't finish the sentence. I said, "I'm going to answer that question with honesty instead of with kindness, which is my way of respecting you." She said, "Okay." I said, "There is a possibility. It depends on what you do from today forward, not on what you say today, on what you do. Over months and years, on whether you show up the way the Hendersons showed up consistently without requiring me to perform gratitude for it." She said, "We can do that." I said, "I don't know that. I'll know it over time." I said, "And one more thing. The baby, my child, will know the Hendersons as grandparents. That is established. Whatever relationship you build with my child will be in addition to that, not instead of it." My father said, "Of course." I said, "It's not of course. I'm telling you explicitly so there is no misunderstanding." He said, "I understand. And I mean of course." I said, "Okay." We sat together for another 2 hours. Not in the heavy silence of confrontation, in the gradual, careful silence, and then careful conversation of people who are beginning something that they are not certain will hold, and who are choosing to begin it anyway. My mother asked about the architecture firm. I showed her photographs of the Rhino project on my laptop. She was quiet for a long time looking at the renderings. She said, "You design buildings." I said, "Yes." She said, "You always drew everything when you were small." I said, "Yes." She said, "I remember that." I said, "So do I." It was the smallest possible point of connection, a memory of drawing, but it was real. My father asked Daniel about the construction business. They talked for 45 minutes about load-bearing structures and material costs and the Denver market, and in the middle of that conversation, my father said, "She always understood structures, even before she could name what that was." Daniel said, "I know. She sees what something could be before she sees what it is." My father said, "Yes, that's exactly right." He said it to Daniel, but he was looking at me. They left at 1 in the afternoon. My mother hugged me at the door. I did not stiffen. I did not lean in. I accepted it for what it was, the first physical contact in 16 years, and I let it be a beginning rather than a resolution. My father shook my hand. He said, "Thank you for letting us come." I said, "You're welcome." He said, "We'll do better." I said, "I'll be watching." He said, "I know." They drove away. I went inside. Daniel was standing in the kitchen. I said, "Well." He said, "Well." I said, "It was a beginning." He said, "Was it the right beginning?" I said, "I think so." "I think they said the honest things." He said, "And did the honest things?" I said, "Yes. They said them and they sat with them. That's different from saying them and deflecting." He said, "How do you feel?" I said, like I've been holding a door closed for a long time, and today I opened it a crack to see if the light on the other side was the kind that should come in. He said, and I said, it needs more time before I know. He said, that's okay. I said, yes, I called the Hendersons that afternoon. Mrs. Henderson answered. I said, they came. She said, how was it? I said, honest. She said, that's a start. I said, yes. She said, how are you feeling? I said, like I did something right. She said, you did. I said, Carol. She said, yes. I said, thank you, for the door 16 years ago, for everything between the door and today. She said, baby girl, you don't have to thank me. I said, I know, I'm thanking you anyway. She said, you've got a good life, Miriam. I said, I built a good life. She said, yes, you built it. She said, how's that baby? I said, kicking. She said, already? I said, just started. Daniel put his hand on my stomach last night for the first time and felt it. She said, how was that? I said, he looked like a man who had been waiting for something his whole life and had just arrived. She said, yes, that's exactly what that is. I said, I love you. She said, I love you too, sweetheart. I said, front row at the birth, Carol. She said, where else would I be? The baby was born in June. Her name is Clara. Clara Miriam Osei Callahan. She weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces, and she arrived on a Wednesday morning after 14 hours that I am not going to describe in detail because they belong to Daniel and to me and to Mrs. Henderson, who was in the waiting room and who was the second person to hold Clara after Daniel and me. She was also the first person to cry. I called my parents from the hospital room with Clara on my chest. My mother answered in one ring. I said, she's here. My mother made the specific sound that she had made in the January living room, the not-a-word sound of something landing somewhere deep. She said, is she? I said, she's perfect. 7'4". Her name is Clara. My mother said, Clara. I said, yes. She said, Miriam. I said, yes, Mom. She said, thank you for calling. I said, I told you I'd be in touch. She was quiet. I said, Mom, we're going to take things slowly. The Hendersons are coming this weekend. You and Dad can come in 3 weeks when we've had time to settle. She said, of course. I said, 3 weeks is not a punishment. It's the order of things. She said, I understand. I said, the Hendersons will always be first in this. I need you to understand that. She said, I understand. I said, okay. She said, Miriam. I said, yes. She said, we'll be there in 3 weeks. I said, I know. She said, we will spend the rest of our lives being there. I said, I'll be watching. She said, we know. My parents came 3 weeks after Clara was born. They came for 4 days. My mother held Clara for the first time on the 3rd day. After 3 days of being in the house, and being present in the way I had asked them to be present, helpful without overstepping, engaged without demanding honest in the small daily ways that are harder than grand gestures. She held Clara and looked at her and did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, she looks like you. I said, Daniel thinks she looks like him. She said, she has your eyes. I said, I know. She said, I missed 16 years. I said, yes. She said, I'm not going to miss what comes next. I said, that depends on you. She said, I know. I am 31 years old. My daughter is 4 months old. She has my eyes and Daniel's hands, and the specific disposition of a person who has decided she is interested in the world, which she demonstrates by tracking every light source in every room she enters with the focused attention of someone who is going to understand structures someday. She has 4 grandparents, Carol and Robert Henderson, who have been her grandparents since before she was born in every way that matters. And my parents, Douglas and Patricia Osei, who are learning how to be grandparents to a child who is not the reason they called but who has become, in the 4 months since her arrival, the reason they are doing the work they should have done 16 years ago. I do not call what my parents are doing forgiveness. I call it a relationship under construction. I call it people attempting to do correctly what they did wrong, and being held accountable to that attempt by a daughter who knows exactly what accountability looks like, because she was raised, from 15 onward, by people who demonstrated it daily. The news my mother called about in October was real. It was also not ready to be called about. It was fragile and mine, and not available to people who had not done the work of being trustworthy. What my parents thought they were calling about was a grandchild who would give them a way back in without the work. What they got instead was a daughter who required the work first. The grandchild came after the work. That is the correct order. That is the order everything should arrive in. That is the order I will teach Clara. Do the work first. Everything real comes after. If someone put you out and called back when they thought you had something they wanted, you are not alone.